Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into some global economics today? All
Always.
right, good to hear. We're talking about Canada and some pretty serious tariffs they're facing from the US.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, Uggle is right. These aren't just any tariffs. We're talking the kind that could potentially slam the brakes on their whole economy.
Really? For how long?
Well, get this. We're talking about potentially for the next 2 years.
Wow, that's serious.
Yeah, no kidding. And the source we're looking at today to guide us through this is an article by David Gambrell called Canada's Strategy for Navigating Trump's Tariffs.
Okay, so what are we hoping to get out of this deep dive today?
Great question. Well, first off, we'll unpack the challenges Canada is up against because of these tariffs.
Makes sense.
Then we'll explore some of the strategies Canada's considering to fight back.
Okay, cool.
And who knows, maybe we'll even find some takeaways that we can all apply to our own lives, even if none of us are dealing with international trade wars or anything like that.
I like it. Always good to find those personal takeaways.
Exactly. Okay, so let's jump right into the thick of things.
Sounds good.
What exactly is the threat that Canada is facing here? Well, the article quotes the Bank of Canada's governor as saying that these tariffs could actually wipe out growth. That's not just a little blip on the radar.
No, definitely
That's
not.
like a full-on economic freeze.
And I imagine the history between the US and Canada makes this even more complicated.
It definitely does. They've always been close trading partners, so this feels like a pretty major shift.
For sure.
So, okay, if you're Canada, what's the game plan? What do you do?
Yeah, what are their options?
Well, the article points to a couple of key strategies they're thinking about, and the first one is diversification.
Diversification.
Classic strategy.
Like not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. So basically, the idea is for Canada to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market and find new trading partners.
Makes sense, but who would they even trade with?
Well, the article specifically mentions the European Union, Britain, and Japan as potential partners.
Okay, I can see the EU and Britain. They've kind of had their own issues with the US on the international stage lately.
Exactly, like with NATO and stuff, so maybe they're looking for stronger partnerships elsewhere too.
And plus, the EU and Canada already have that trade agreement, CETA.
Right, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement,
Right. Well,
which could make things easier, I guess.
yeah, maybe. But the EU also has a lot of red tape, especially when it comes to agriculture. I imagine that could be a big hurdle for Canada to overcome.
That's true. And then there's Japan, which seems like kind of a wild card to me.
Why do you say that?
Well, they're on the other side of the world.
True, but it's not as random as it sounds. Japan really needs new sources of energy because they're trying to cut back on how much they rely on Russian liquefied natural gas.
Oh, right, right.
And guess what? Canada could be a major supplier of that.
Okay, that makes sense.
But there's also a potential downside here.
Oh, what's that?
Well, Canada's also committed to some pretty ambitious environmental goals, and if they start producing and exporting more LNG, well, it could complicate things for them on that front.
So even diversification comes with its own set of challenges.
Exactly. It's not just about finding new customers, it's about navigating a whole new landscape of opportunities and obstacles.
Very true. It's kind of a good lesson for all of us, I think.
How so?
Well, whether we're talking about our careers or our investments or even where we get our news, having a diverse portfolio can be a smart move.
Yeah, helps you weather the storms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, now for the second strategy the article highlights, and this one is a little more, well, unexpected.
Oh, what is it?
They talk about using data as a weapon.
As a weapon. That sounds intense.
Yeah, it does. But the article actually describes how Canada has already used data strategically in its dealings with the U.S. For example, they talk about this guy, Jim Haley, who used to be a Canadian IMF executive. And he used AI to analyze how retaliatory tariffs would affect the U.S. And get this, he was able to pinpoint which specific U.S. states and even which members of Congress would be hit the hardest.
So it's more like targeted persuasion than an actual attack?
Yeah, I think so. It's about showing the U.S. how interconnected their economies really are.
Like how much they stand to lose.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And then the article mentions another example where data was used, this time defensively, and this one involves something called electronic bills of lading.
Electronic bills of lading. I'm not sure I know what those are.
Yeah, me neither. But apparently they're like these digital documents that keep track of shipments, and they were introduced as part of the USMCA.
Oh, the updated trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada?
That's the one.
Okay.
And apparently these electronic bills of lading create tons of data that show how all the trade between these three countries works.
Wow. So Canada can use that data to show how much the US actually depends on their goods and how disruptive these tariffs would be for everyone.
Exactly. Data can be pretty powerful for persuasion.
Definitely. Makes you think about how important it is to be able to understand and use data effectively, even in our own lives.
Totally. Like, think about negotiating a raise at work or trying to get a better deal on your phone plan. Having the right information can make all the difference.
For sure. Okay, so we've got diversification and data as a weapon. But the article also brings up a really tricky ethical question.
Ooh, what's that?
It asks whether Canada should retaliate at all.
Ooh, good question.
Should they hit back with their own counter-tariffs or try to negotiate?
It's a tough one.
It is. And the article quotes Christopher Sands, who's the director of the U.S.-based Wilson Center's Canada Institute. And he makes the argument that standing firm could actually earn Canada more respect from someone like President Trump.
Really? So the idea is that showing strength earns respect.
Right. It's about showing that you're not going to be bullied, even if it means taking a hit.
Like, we're willing to lose together, but we're not going to be pushed around.
Exactly. But of course, there's another side to this whole retaliation thing, too. Well, retaliation could really escalate things, and then you end up in this, like, tit-for-tat trade war.
Yeah, which wouldn't be good for anyone.
Definitely not.
So how do you even weigh the risks of something like that? Like, how do you know if it's the right move or not?
I mean, I think you'd have to look at everything really carefully. Think about the long-term consequences.
Yeah.
Maybe even bring in some outside experts, like people who specialize in international trade or diplomacy.
Right.
It's not a decision to make lightly.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
You know, this whole conversation about data being used as a weapon reminded me of something I read about a while back.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
This was back when they were renegotiating NAFTA.
Oh, right before it became the USMCA.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the U.S. was pushing for some changes that would benefit their auto industry.
And of course, Canada and Mexico weren't too keen on that.
Well, yeah, it wasn't really in their best interests.
Makes sense.
So anyway, Canada ended up doing something pretty clever.
Oh, what did they do?
They put together this huge data set that tracked every single part that went into making a car in North America.
Wow, every single part. That's incredible.
I know, right? Talk about attention to detail.
So what did they do with all that data?
Well, what they found was that even the cars that were assembled in the U.S. relied heavily on parts made in Canada and Mexico.
So they were all interconnected.
Exactly.
So in this case, the data actually helped them find common ground.
Yeah, it's kind of cool, right?
Right.
Instead of being a weapon, data was like a peacemaker in this case.
I like that. It just
Okay.
goes to show you that data can be used in so many different ways.
Definitely. It all depends on how you use it.
Right, right.
Okay, so we talked about diversification and using data strategically,
Yeah.
but I want to circle back to that ethical dilemma we were talking about before.
Yeah, the retaliation question.
Should Canada fight back with counter-tariffs?
That's a tough one. You know, some experts say that a strong response is the best way to prevent more aggression down the line.
Like, you have to stand up for yourself.
Right, even if it costs you something in the short term.
Yeah, I can see that.
But then on the other hand, retaliation could backfire.
How so?
Well, it could escalate the whole conflict, you know, and then you end up in this tit-for-tat situation where everyone loses.
And it's not just Canada and the U.S. who would be affected, right?
Exactly. A trade war between those two countries would have ripple effects across the whole global economy.
So how do you even begin to decide what the right move is?
I think it comes down to judgment.
Yeah.
You have to analyze the situation really carefully, think about what the long-term consequences might be.
Yeah.
And like we said before, maybe even consult with some experts in international trade and diplomacy.
Right.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
You know what I find interesting about all of this? This whole situation with Canada and the U.S., it's not really just about tariffs and trade wars.
What do you mean?
I think it's about something much bigger. It's about how we deal with conflict and disagreements on a global scale.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. That's a really good point. Especially in today's world where everything's so interconnected.
Exactly. Finding ways to resolve our differences peacefully has never been more important.
Absolutely.
But that's easier said than done, right?
Oh, for sure.
Especially when you're dealing with someone who's known for being unpredictable and aggressive.
Yeah, that definitely adds another layer of complexity.
I mean, how do you even approach a situation like that?
Well, first off, I think it's important to remember that even the toughest conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and negotiation.
So never give up on diplomacy.
Exactly. Second, I think it's crucial to build strong alliances with other countries that share your values.
Strength in numbers kind of thing.
Right. Having a united front can be a powerful way to deter aggression. And finally, It's essential to be strategic and thoughtful in how you respond to provocation.
So retaliation isn't always the answer.
Not necessarily. Sometimes it's better to take a step back and consider all your
It's
options.
like picking your battles.
Precisely. And I think Canada's response to these tariffs is a really interesting case study in how to do that.
Definitely a lot to learn from their approach.
For sure.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways here? What have we learned?
Well, I think the first big takeaway is the importance of diversification.
Right. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Whether we're talking about our investments, our skills, or even just our sources of information, spreading our risk can make us much more resilient in the long run.
I totally agree. What else?
I think the second big takeaway is the power of data.
Oh yeah, data is everywhere these days.
It really is. And it can be used for so many different things, from shaping public opinion to making important policy decisions.
Pretty amazing.
But it's not just about having access to data, it's about knowing how to interpret it and use it effectively.
Data literacy is key.
Absolutely. And finally, I think this whole situation reminds us that even in a world that feels really chaotic and unpredictable, there's always hope for peaceful resolution.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah, diplomacy and dialogue can still prevail, even when things look really tough.
Before we move on, though, I have one more question for you.
Sure, what is it?
Given the potential for these tariffs to really damage Canada's economy, is there anything they can do to soften the blow?
That's a great question, and one that I know Canadian policymakers are wrestling with right now.
So what are some of their options?
Well, one thing they could do is provide targeted financial assistance to the industries that are hit hardest by the tariffs.
Like temporary subsidies or tax breaks?
Exactly, just something to help them weather the storm. Another strategy could be to invest in infrastructure projects that would create jobs and stimulate economic activity.
I see. So it's about finding ways to offset the potential losses and keep the economy moving forward.
Precisely. And of course, there's always the option of continuing to negotiate with the U.S. and trying to find a more mutually agreeable solution.
Right. Always keep those lines of communication open.
Exactly. At the end of the day, the best course of action for Canada will depend on a lot of different factors: economics, politics, social considerations, the whole nine yards.
It's complicated.
Oh, for sure. International relations are rarely simple.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Canada's strategy for dealing with these U.S. tariffs, what's the one big question you want to leave our listeners with?
That's a good question. I think the question I'd pose to our listeners is, in a world that's increasingly driven by data, how can we use information effectively to protect our own interests? And I don't just mean on a national or global scale, but on a personal level too.
Wow, that's a really powerful question. It makes you think about the role data plays in our lives and how we can use it wisely and responsibly.
Right, because data can be such a powerful tool, but it can also be misused.
Definitely food for thought.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll leave you all to ponder that question and think about how you can apply what we've discussed today to your own lives. Where can you diversify? How can you leverage data? And when is it worth taking a stand, even if it means potential costs? We'll be back soon with the final part of our deep dive, so stay tuned. It's funny, as we've been talking about all this stuff with Canada, I keep thinking about how it relates to us, just regular people.
Yeah, me too. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, global economics and all that.
But there are definitely some lessons here we can all apply to our own lives.
Oh, absolutely. Like we were talking about before, diversification, that's not just for countries, right?
Exactly. We can all diversify in our own way.
Whether it's your skills or your investments or even just like who you hang out with, your social circle, having a diverse portfolio can really help you adapt to change.
Like spreading your risk, right? Don't put all your eggs in one basket, as they say.
Exactly. And I think that applies to our thinking too.
How so?
It's important to be open to different ideas, different perspectives, even if they challenge what you already believe.
It's about being open-minded.
Yeah. And being willing to learn new things, it can help you make better decisions, especially in a world that's as complex as ours.
Definitely. And speaking of navigating a complex world, we were talking about the power of data earlier.
Right. Data is everywhere these days.
It's crazy how much influence it has, shaping public opinion, driving policy decisions.
But it's not just about having access to data, right? It's about being able to understand it, to use it in a way that's effective.
Yeah, data literacy is a superpower these days.
I totally agree. We're bombarded with information from all sides, so being able to sift through it all, figure out what's actually important, that's crucial.
And being able to spot the biases.
Yeah.
recognize the agendas that might be shaping the data we see.
Exactly. It's all about critical thinking. That's more important now than ever.
Couldn't agree more. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Canada and how they're dealing with these U.S. tariffs,
Yeah.
what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
That's a good question. Hmm. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we all have the power to make a difference, even when things feel really overwhelming.
Like, even when the problems seem too big to tackle.
Even then, whether it's standing up for what we believe in, or diversifying our own resources, or just being smarter about how we use information.
It's about taking action, even if it's small.
Exactly. It's easy to feel helpless when you see all the conflict and injustice in the world, but we all have agency. We all have the ability to make positive change.
So don't underestimate yourself.
Absolutely. And remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Canada's strategy for navigating U.S. tariffs. We hope you found it interesting, maybe even a little bit inspiring.
It was great being here, and to our listeners out there, keep the conversation going. Think about what we talked about today and ask yourself, where can I diversify? How can I use data to my advantage? And when is it worth taking a stand, even if there might be a cost?
Great questions. Until next time, keep diving deep.